After the will reading, my billionaire grandfather's lawyer called and said, "You need to come now. Come alone." I was still sitting in my car when my phone vibrated. The will reading had ended less than an hour ago. My family had already decided who won, who lost, and where I belonged quietly, painfully, without asking me a single question. "My name is Chloe Miller." And at that moment, I thought the worst part was already over. Then I answered the call. "Chloe," the lawyer said, his voice low and unsteady, "you need to come to my office right now. Don't tell anyone, and don't bring anyone with you." I laughed nervously and asked why. There was a long pause. "Because what you heard today wasn't the whole truth," he said. "And if the wrong people find out you're here, everything changes." As I drove toward his office, one thought wouldn't leave my mind. If my grandfather trusted me with this secret after his death, what was everyone else so desperate to hide? The will reading took place in a quiet conference room that smelled faintly of leather chairs and expensive coffee. The kind of room where people pretended to be respectful, while silently counting what they hoped to gain. My billionaire grandfather, Robert Miller, had been buried just 3 days earlier. And yet, sitting around that long polished table, no one looked like they was grieving anymore. They looked like heirs. My uncle leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, already confident. My aunt kept glancing at her phone, as if the words on the paper in front of her were just a formality delaying her next appointment. Even my cousins, people I grew up with, avoided my eyes, like they already knew something I didn't. I sat at the far end of the table, alone. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading in a calm, measured voice, as if he were announcing quarterly earnings instead of my grandfather's final words. Stock portfolios, real estate, trust funds. Every name but mine came with numbers that made the room subtly shift. Small smiles, relaxed shoulders, quiet exhales of relief. Then my turn came, and to my granddaughter, Chloe Miller. The room went still. I straightened without meaning to, my heart tightening. I leave the sum of $50,000 to be transferred within 30 days. That was it. No properties, no shares, no role in the family foundation. Just a number that felt strangely small in a room full of wealth. For a split second, I wondered if I had misheard, but when I looked up, no one else looked confused. My uncle gave a thin smile and said softly, "Well, that's generous, considering." Considering what? No one answered that question. They didn't need to. The message was clear. This is where you stand. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I simply nodded. Because what none of them knew was that my grandfather and I had been close in a way they never were. Quiet conversations, long walks, evenings where he spoke less about money and more about regret, and that made what I'd just heard feel wrong. As the meeting wrapped up, chairs scraped against the floor. People stood, already talking about logistics, transfers, next steps. My aunt brushed past me and said, almost kindly, "You should be grateful, Chloe. Many people would be thrilled." I forced a smile. "I am," I lied. Outside, the late afternoon sun felt too bright. I sat in my car with the engine off, staring at the steering wheel, replaying my grandfather's voice in my head. "Never confuse fairness with truth," he once told me. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Now, I felt it in my bones. The will reading hadn't just distributed money. It had drawn a line, and I had been placed firmly on the outside of it. I was about to start the engine when my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost. That single decision to answer instead of walking away would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my grandfather, and myself. The phone kept vibrating in my hand as if it were impatient with me. I stared at the screen for a few seconds longer than I should have, then finally answered. "Hello?" "Chloe," a man said. His voice was familiar, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't confident or polished like it had been an hour earlier in the conference room. It was tight, controlled, afraid. "This is David Harper," he said. "Your grandfather's attorney." I glanced instinctively toward the building behind me, half expecting someone to be watching from the glass windows. "Yes," I said cautiously. "Is something wrong?" There was a pause. Not a technical one, a deliberate one. "You need to come to my office right now," he said. "Not tomorrow, not next week. Now." My grip tightened around the phone. "I just left," I said. "If this is about the transfer paperwork, I can—" "No," he cut in sharply. Then softer. This isn't about paperwork. Had 8 Marfil S. Paster. I felt a strange chill move through my chest. Mr. Harper, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You just read my grandfather's will. If there was something else, why wasn't it said in the room? Another pause. Because, he said slowly, there were people in that room who were never meant to hear it. I swallowed. Chloe, he added, lowering his voice, you need to come alone. That single phrase made my stomach drop. Alone? I repeated. Why would I? Do not tell your family, he said, firmer now. Do not call anyone, and do not mention this conversation. My pulse quickened. You're scaring me. I know, he said quietly, and I'm sorry. But if you trust your grandfather even a little, you'll get in your car and drive here now. The line went dead. I sat there in silence, phone still pressed to my ear, my heart beating louder than the traffic passing behind me. Come alone, don't tell anyone. Those weren't the words of a routine legal follow-up. They sounded like a warning. I considered calling my mother, then my uncle, then one of my cousins. But something stopped me. My grandfather had always hated scenes, hated noise, hated confrontation. When something mattered, he handled it quietly, carefully, and always behind closed doors. If he'd left something unfinished, if he'd trusted David Harper with it, I started the car. As I pulled onto the road, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from my aunt. Lunch tomorrow to talk next steps? We should stay united. United. The word made me uneasy. The city blurred past my windows as I drove toward the lawyer's office downtown. My thoughts raced faster than the traffic. Why me? Why now? Why hadn't my grandfather said anything while he was alive? Then I remembered the last conversation we'd had, just weeks before he died. We were sitting in his study. He looked tired, thinner than usual, but his eyes were sharp. Chloe, he said, if one day you learn something about this family that makes you uncomfortable, promise me you won't ignore it. I'd laughed back then. You're being dramatic. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm being careful, he corrected. At the time, I thought he meant business. Now, I wasn't so sure. When I arrived at David Harper's building, the lobby was nearly empty. The security desk was unattended. The elevator hummed softly as I rode up alone, my reflection staring back at me in the mirrored walls. My stomach twisted with every floor that passed. When the doors opened, I saw his office door slightly ajar. A sliver of light spilled into the hallway. I hesitated. Then I stepped forward, not knowing that whatever waited on the other side of that door would permanently change how I saw my family and myself. The office smelled different from before. Not like coffee and paper, but something sharper like stress that had been sitting in the air too long. Chloe, David Harper said, the moment I stepped inside. He stood up so quickly that his chair rolled back and bumped against the wall. Close the door, please. I did. The click of the lock echoed louder than it should have. He didn't offer me a seat right away. Instead, he walked to the window and glanced down at the street, then pulled the blinds halfway closed. You're probably wondering why I didn't say any of this during the will reading, he said. Yes, I replied. That's exactly what I'm wondering. He finally gestured toward the chair across from his desk. I sat, my hands folded tightly in my lap. What I read earlier, he continued, choosing his words carefully, was your grandfather's official will. My chest tightened. And this isn't? This, he said, reaching into a locked drawer and pulling out a thick folder, is what your grandfather instructed me to show only you and only after the will reading was complete. He placed the folder between us. It was plain. No label, no markings, just heavy. I stared at it without touching it. Why me? David's mouth tightened. Because he trusted you. That word hit harder than I expected. He didn't trust anyone else? I asked. He hesitated. That was answer enough. Chloe, he said quietly, your grandfather was deeply concerned about what would happen once he was gone. Not just to his assets, but to the truth. I felt my pulse in my throat. What truth? Instead of answering, he slid the folder toward me. Open it. My fingers trembled as I lifted the cover. Inside were documents I didn't recognize. Legal notes, handwritten letters, and copies of emails. Some were dated years back, others were recent, All of them carried my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting in the margins. "What is this?" I whispered. "Those are records your grandfather kept privately," David said. "Not filed, not shared, not included in the estate summary." I flipped through a few pages. There were references to power of attorney changes, notes questioning financial decisions made on his behalf, emails he'd never sent, marked unsent in bold ink. My heart began to race. "He believed," David continued, "that someone close to him was making decisions he didn't fully agree with, decisions he felt pressured into." "Pressured," I repeated. "Yes." The words sat heavy between us. "Why didn't he stop them?" I asked. "He was powerful, he had money, lawyers." David let out a slow breath. "Because power doesn't protect you from family." I closed the folder slowly. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "If there was something wrong, why give everyone else so much? Why leave me so little?" David looked at me carefully. "Because the will wasn't about reward," he said. "It was about exposure." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He believed," David said, lowering his voice, "that if the truth came out all at once, certain people would react badly. He wanted to see who felt safe and who felt threatened." A chill ran through me. "You're saying the will was a test?" "Yes." "And I failed?" I asked bitterly. "No," he said quickly. "You passed." I looked up at him sharply. "You were the only one who didn't argue," he said. "You didn't demand answers. You didn't try to negotiate. You didn't look relieved or angry. You just accepted it." My throat tightened. "Because I thought he didn't care." David shook his head. "Because he knew you'd come here when I called." I leaned back, suddenly dizzy. "So what am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. "Because if my family finds out—" "They can't," he said firmly. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because some of the names in that folder," he said slowly, "belong to people who don't like losing control." Said as it that Keynes. Silence filled the room. I thought of the smiles at the will reading, the quick confidence, the way no one had looked surprised by my small inheritance. "You're telling me my grandfather was scared?" I said. "Yes." "And you're telling me," I continued, my voice shaking now, "that he trusted me enough to leave this behind?" David nodded. I stared at the folder again. Whatever was inside, it wasn't money. It was a responsibility. And the moment I accepted it, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The will reading hadn't been the end of my grandfather's story. It was the beginning of mine. I didn't leave the office right away. I sat there, staring at the folder on David Harper's desk, as if it might start speaking on its own if I waited long enough. "Tell me the truth," I said finally. "Not the careful version, not the lawyer version." David's shoulders sagged, just slightly. "The truth," he said, "is that your grandfather spent the last year of his life afraid of his own family." Those words landed harder than anything I had read so far. "That's not possible," I said. "He was surrounded by people, by relatives, by people who needed him," David interrupted gently, "and people who were very invested in keeping things exactly the way they were." I looked down at my hands. They were clenched so tightly my knuckles had turned pale. "He started calling me late at night," David continued. "Not about contracts, not about money, about pressure." "Pressure to do what?" "To sign things he didn't fully agree with. To approve changes he didn't feel comfortable questioning anymore. Have never buddy stating." My chest tightened. "Why didn't he just say no?" David hesitated again. It was becoming a pattern. "Because saying no," he said slowly, "meant conflict. And your grandfather hated conflict more than he feared consequences." I flipped the folder open again, my eyes scanning pages I hadn't dared to read closely before. There it was. A handwritten note in the margin of a legal draft. "They say it's easier this way. I'm not so sure." "Who are they?" I asked. David didn't answer immediately. "Chloe," he said. "If I say their names now and you walk out unprepared, I can't protect you." The word protect made something twist in my stomach. "I don't need protection," I said, though my voice betrayed me. "You do," he replied calmly. "Because the moment they realize you've seen this, their behavior toward you will change." "How?" "Subtle at first," he said. "Questions, invitations, concern. And if that doesn't work, pressure." "Pressure," I swallowed. You're talking about my family. Yes. The room felt smaller. The walls closer. Why leave me so little? I asked again, my voice breaking despite myself. Why make me look insignificant? David leaned forward. Because invisibility can be safety, he said. He believed that if you looked unimportant, you'd be ignored long enough for the truth to survive. I laughed bitterly. So he let them humiliate me. He let them underestimate you, David corrected. Silence stretched between us. I loved him, I said quietly. I thought he loved me too. David's expression softened. He did. That's why he didn't give you money. I looked up sharply. Money ties you down, he continued. It makes you dependent. It makes you visible. He wanted you free enough to walk away if things turned dangerous. Dangerous. The word echoed in my head. So, what happens now? I asked. David reached into another drawer and pulled out a single envelope. This, he said, is a personal letter your grandfather wrote to you. Not as an heir, not as a beneficiary, as his granddaughter. My hands shook as I took it. You should read it alone, he added. But before you go, there's something else you need to know. I looked up. Some members of your family have already contacted me since the will reading, he said quietly. My heart skipped. About what? About whether there was anything else, he said. Anything that wasn't read out loud. I stood abruptly. They know? I asked. They suspect, he replied. And suspicion makes people impatient. I clutched the envelope to my chest. Chloe, David said firmly. From this moment on, every choice you make matters. Who you trust, what you say, and when you decide to speak. I nodded slowly, my mind racing. As I left the office, the city felt louder than before. Every passing glance felt heavier. Every vibration of my phone made my heart jump, because I understood something now. My grandfather hadn't left me behind. He had placed me at the center of a storm he'd been holding back for years. And, whether I wanted it or not, that storm was finally moving. I didn't plan to confront my family that night. But the moment I stepped into my apartment and saw the missed calls piling up on my phone, I knew waiting was no longer an option. 3 from my uncle, 2 from my aunt, 1 message from my cousin that simply said, "We need to talk. Tonight." They already knew something had shifted. I stood in the middle of my living room, my grandfather's sealed letter still untouched on the table, and felt the weight of a decision pressing down on my chest. If I stayed silent, I could pretend nothing had changed. If I spoke, everything would unravel. An hour later, I found myself standing in my uncle Richard Miller's living room. Everyone was there. Too many people, too neatly arranged. Like a meeting that had been rehearsed. Richard sat in his armchair, hands folded calmly. My Aunt Linda stood by the window, arms crossed. My cousins leaned against the counter, avoiding my eyes. No one asked how I was doing. "Chloe," Richard said gently, "thank you for coming." That tone. The one adults use when they think they're being kind but are really asserting control. "You wanted to talk," I said. "Yes," Linda replied quickly. "We're concerned about you." Concerned? I felt my jaw tighten. Concerned about what? I asked. Richard sighed, as if this were all terribly inconvenient. "We heard you went back to David Harper's office." The room went quiet. I didn't deny it. "Why?" my cousin Evan asked. The will reading was over. I had questions, I said evenly. "Questions about money?" Linda asked, her lips tightening. "No," I replied. "Questions about the truth." The word landed like a dropped glass. Richard's expression changed. Just slightly. "Chloe," he said calmly. "Your grandfather was very old. He was confused near the end. You shouldn't be digging into things that will only hurt you. I'm stay too, and it my state might change to wong the cative later. And I get a not this sanger. Change tooted to do common." I felt something sharp rise in my chest. "You mean hurt you?" I said. Linda's eyes flashed. "That's unfair." "Is it?" I asked. "Because none of you seemed surprised when I was left with almost nothing." Silence. Then Evan laughed softly. "Come on. Grandpa always favored you emotionally. This was about balance." Balance. I thought of the documents in that folder. The notes. The hesitation in my grandfather's handwriting. "I was close to him," I said. "That doesn't make me blind." Richard leaned forward. "We're not saying you're blind. We're saying you're vulnerable." The word wrapped itself around me like a trap. Grief makes people imagine things, Linda added. David Harper is a lawyer. Lawyers complicate matters. I looked at her directly. Or they reveal them. Her jaw clenched. Richard raised a hand. Let's be clear, he said. There is nothing else. No hidden instructions. No secret meanings. And whatever David showed you, he showed me my grandfather's words, I interrupted. That was when the room shifted. Evan straightened. Linda's hand tightened on the back of the chair. Richard's calm expression finally cracked. What exactly did he show you? Richard asked. I felt my heart pounding, but I held his gaze. You're asking the wrong question, I said. You should be asking why he didn't trust you with it. Linda stepped closer. Chloe, listen to yourself. You're accusing your own family. I'm listening to my grandfather, I replied. Richard's voice hardened. This ends now. The gentleness was gone. You walk away from this, he said, and you keep whatever dignity you have left. You push further, and things get complicated. I swallowed. Is that a threat? I asked. He smiled thinly. It's advice. I felt the room closing in on me, the expectations, the pressure, the unspoken message. Stay quiet, be grateful, don't ruin this. For a moment, I almost did. Then I remembered my grandfather's voice. Never confuse peace with silence. I'm not going to pretend anymore, I said quietly. And I'm not afraid of the truth, Linda scoffed. You'll regret this. Maybe, I said. But I'd regret silence more. No one spoke as I turned toward the door. Behind me, Richard's voice followed, colder than before. If you do this, he said, you're no longer part of this family. I paused, my hand on the doorframe. I didn't turn around. I said softly, I stopped being part of it long before tonight. When the door closed behind me, my hands were shaking. But beneath the fear, beneath the loss, something else had taken root. Clarity. Because now I knew the truth they were so desperate to bury. And I was done protecting people who had never protected my grandfather or me. I didn't sleep that night. Every conversation replayed itself in my head, the careful smiles, the warnings disguised as advice, the way the word family had been used like a leash instead of a bond. At sunrise, I made my decision. I called David Harper. I'm ready, I said the moment he answered. There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet exhale. I was hoping you'd say that. We met again that morning, this time not in his main office but in a smaller conference room tucked away from the street. The blinds were closed. The table was bare except for a legal pad and a recorder. This is where things become formal, David said. And once we begin, there's no pretending anymore. I'm done pretending, I replied. He nodded and slid a document across the table. Your grandfather prepared a supplemental legal statement, he explained. It wasn't part of the public will. It was designed to activate only if certain conditions were met. Conditions like what? I asked. Like pressure, manipulation, or attempts to suppress information. My chest tightened. So, he expected this. Yes, David said, and he prepared safeguards. For the next several hours, we went through everything: emails, handwritten notes, timestamps, and records that showed patterns I hadn't wanted to see before. Not crimes described in dramatic terms, but something quieter and more disturbing. Systematic control. Decisions made on my grandfather's behalf without full consent, and financial arrangements that benefited a very small circle. Nothing here is explosive on its own, David said carefully. But together, it tells a story. What kind of story? I asked. One of influence, he said, and misuse of trust. He explained the next steps calmly, methodically. Independent reviews, court filings, protective measures. You won't be alone in this, he said. The law exists for moments like this. I laughed softly, more tired than amused. Funny. My family always said law was just a tool for people with power. David looked at me steadily. Then, let's use it to protect the truth instead. By the afternoon, formal notices had been prepared. Oversight bodies were contacted. Certain asset transfers were temporarily frozen, not as punishment, but as precaution. When I left the building, the city felt different. Not safer, not calmer, clearer. My phone buzzed again. A message from my aunt. You don't understand what you're doing. I didn't reply. Another message followed, this time from my cousin. Please stop. This is getting out of hand. I silenced my phone. For the first time since my grandfather died, I felt something other than grief or fear. I felt grounded. Because choosing the law wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about money. And it wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to carry a secret that had already destroyed one man's peace. That evening, I finally opened the personal letter my grandfather had written to me. Chloe, if you are reading this, it means you were strong enough to listen when others demanded silence. I'm sorry I couldn't fix everything myself. I'm not asking you to fight for me, only to live honestly. Even when it costs you comfort. Tears blurred the page. Whatever you choose, know this. You were never forgotten. You were chosen. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Outside my window, the city lights flickered on one by one. Tomorrow, my family would react. There would be headlines, meetings, consequences. Relationships would fracture further before they could ever heal. But tonight, for the first time, I knew I had done the right thing. Not as an heir. Not as a granddaughter. But as someone who finally understood that truth doesn't destroy families, silence does. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves. At first, there were emails formal, careful, written by people who suddenly preferred legal language over family conversations. Requests for clarification. Notices of review. Polite acknowledgments that sounded nothing like the voices I grew up with. Then came the silence. Group chats went quiet. Invitations stopped. Holidays became dates on a calendar instead of plans. When I walked past familiar places in the city, I felt like a guest in a life I used to belong to. I told myself I was prepared for that. I wasn't. Some nights, I sat alone in my apartment and wondered if I'd imagined everything, if maybe my grandfather had just been tired, paranoid, overthinking. The doubt crept in quietly, the way it always does when you stand alone for too long. But then, I would remember the look on my uncle's face when I asked the wrong question. And the doubt would fade. David kept me informed, step by step. Independent professionals were reviewing documents. Decisions my grandfather never felt comfortable with were finally being examined in the open. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, just truth, moving at the speed of the law. Whatever happens, David told me during one call, you did the right thing by not carrying this alone. Still, doing the right thing didn't make the loneliness disappear. One afternoon, I received a message from my cousin Evan. I hope you know what you've done. I stared at it for a long time before replying. I do. That was all I sent. I started seeing a counselor a few weeks later, not because anyone told me to, but because I realized how deeply silence had trained me to minimize my own instincts, to doubt discomfort, to excuse pressure. Naming those patterns felt like learning a new language. She trusted you because you listened, the counselor said once, after I told her about my grandfather. That's not a small thing. Slowly, life began to rearrange itself. I went back to work. I reconnected with friends I hadn't spoken to in years, people who knew me without expectations or inheritance or history attached. I learned what it felt like to be valued simply for being present. Some mornings, grief still hit without warning. Other days, relief surprised me, because for the first time, I wasn't pretending. I wasn't playing the role of the agreeable granddaughter. I wasn't shrinking to keep the peace. I wasn't carrying someone else's fear. One evening, as I walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, I realized something had changed inside me. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. Whatever the outcome, whatever relationships were permanently altered, I had chosen clarity over comfort. And that choice, painful as it was, had given me something I didn't know I'd been missing, my own voice. Time didn't fix everything, but it softened the sharpest edges. Months later, the legal process reached its conclusion. Certain decisions made in my grandfather's final years were officially reversed. Oversight was restored. His intentions, quiet, careful, and often misunderstood, were finally recognized for what they were. There were no dramatic apologies. No sudden reunions. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had been real all along. I stood alone one afternoon in my grandfather's old study, the room where he used to sit for hours, thinking. The shelves were emptier now, the desk cleared of papers, but the air still felt familiar. I placed his letter back into my bag, knowing I would carry it with me wherever I went. For a long time, I believed families broke because of conflict. Now I understand something different. Families break because of silence. Silence that allows pressure to grow. Silence that teaches people to ignore discomfort. Silence that disguises control as care and fear as loyalty. My grandfather didn't ask me to fight. He asked me not to look away. And that changed how I see everything. I learned that money can confuse love, but it can't replace integrity. That being kept comfortable is not the same as being respected. And that walking away from manipulation, even when it wears the face of family, is not betrayal. It's self-respect. If there's one thing I hope someone hearing my story takes with them, it's this. Love should never require you to stay quiet about harm. Protection should never come at the cost of your voice. And the law exists not to punish families but to protect people when loyalty is used against them. I didn't walk away richer in the way people usually mean. But I walked away lighter, free from secrets that were never mine to carry, free from roles I never agreed to play, free to build a life rooted in honesty, not fear. My grandfather once told me that truth doesn't shout, it waits. And when you're finally ready to listen, it asks only one thing in return: courage. That day, I chose it. And I've never regretted that choice since.